So the title of my talk is Oral History at the Crossroads, Sharing Authority in Practice in Project-Based Research. And I sort of begin with Michael Frisch's comment. We need projects that will involve people in exploring what it means to remember and what to do with memories to make them active and alive as opposed to mere objects of collection. And I've often found Michael Frisch's work to be very inspiring. I think it's fair, and I've gone formal with the presentation. I really enjoyed the informal part earlier. That's more who I am, probably. But I wasn't sure what to expect, so I went formal with the presentation. What you're going to see are a number of photographs. I don't like using PowerPoint with a lot of words on them. And you're going to see photographs from our Montreal Life Stories project. And I find still photography is a great way to sort of capture and represent collaboration in process. You know, there's still images, but there's nothing still, there's nothing still about them. So I think it's fair to say that the lone interviewer has long dominated the imagination of oral historians. So much so, in fact, that oral history practice has often been equated with the interviewer-interviewee relationship exclusively. Most of the field's training guides and methodological articles assume that the interviewer is also the primary researcher. If authority is shared, it is generally understood within the confines of the interview and its transcription. There has therefore been remarkably little reflection on oral history methodology and ethics in project-based research, nor have we seriously considered how oral history practice is being transformed by new media and the arts. We're living in quite a remarkable moment that way. Recent calls to share authority after the interview have complicated matters further, opening up new spaces of community-university conversation. Increasingly, the recorded interview is but one step in a longer continuum of collaboration. In collaborative projects, the line between the researcher and the researched is sometimes blurred, and what is on and off the record is somewhat ambiguous. This change in context demands that we widen our conception of oral history practice and consider the ethical challenges and responsibilities in community-university collaboration. For my talk this evening, I propose to explore these issues within the specific context of the Montreal Life Stories project, a major collaborative research project investigating the life stories of Montrealers displaced by war, genocide, and other human rights violations. Through the evidence of life history interviewing and collective storytelling, we asked how large-scale violence is experienced and remembered. What does it mean to be a survivor of mass violence and living in North America? How do individuals and communities construct and transmit their stories to their children and grandchildren? When, where, and why are particular stories about mass violence told, and by whom? We also asked how these life stories or life histories can be represented and communicated to wider publics. Oral history has a pivotal role to play in educating us and our communities about the social preconditions, experiences, and long-term repercussions of crimes against humanity. Through multi-session life history interviewing, we wanted to understand mass violence in the context of lives lived and remembered, so situating it in the before and the after. As a result, the person, and here we have Sarah Toussaint from the Haitian community, rather than the event, in this case the violence perpetrated by the Duvalier dictatorship in Haiti, how the person rather than the event framed the interview. We wanted to know what happened, but also to understand better how mass violence is remembered and what its impact has been over the longue durée, as it rippled outward through individual lives, families, and communities. The Montreal Life Stories project was funded by the Community University Research Alliance, or CURA for short, program of SSHRC, which is the major funder of academic research in Canada. The CURA program is a special one that is premised on the idea that communities can be partners in research and not simply objects of study. Learning with communities, such as the Rwandan community pictured here, represents a fundamentally different way of doing research than what is normally practiced in our universities. who is actually within the research conversation matters, as it shapes what we do, how we envision our projects, the questions we ask, the technologies we adopt or design, and why we do what we do. The project began in 2006 with 40 team members, evenly divided between university-based researchers from a broad range of disciplines and community co-applicants from 17 partner organizations. These were mainly volunteer groups from the city's Rwandan, Cambodian, Haitian, and Jewish communities. It would also include the National Film Board, the Canadian Council for Refugees, which is a major advocacy group on refugee rights, the Montreal Holocaust Memorial Centre, a professional theater company, the school boards, and many others. In the years that followed, the project grew to more than 300 people as community members, artists, educators, interns, and students streamed into the project. Many team members were themselves survivors of mass violence. Others were the children or grandchildren of those displaced. There was even a bit of a family chain migration into the project as one member, then another, and another joined in. The presence of large numbers of young people changed the conversation, raising questions about intergenerational transmission and identity, for example, as there was and is a great deal of silence within families and communities. The project was built on the idea of a shared authority, a phrase that we all know was coined by Michael Frisch in 1990 to describe the co-creation of the interview. The dialogic nature of the interview, the researcher's questions, and the narrator's responses produces a unique source. Not every interview is the same, however, and true partnership must constantly be worked at. A good interview, wrote psychologist Henry Greenspan, is a process in which two people work hard to understand the views and experience of one person, the interviewee. A good collaborative project works in much the same way. Community-university collaboration need not begin and end with the recorded interview. To signal our commitment to sharing authority, we agreed to community-university parity in the composition of the project's coordinating committee, hiring committees, and project-wide committees such as ethics. Profs couldn't simply hire their own, as is usually the case in university research. Our approach therefore differed from other projects in that we emphasized an integrationist model of blended community-university teams of researchers rather than the partnership model of the formal sort of memorandum of understanding, which you often see in Canada. Our coming together was, of course, not without its challenges. In the early days, we struggled to find common ground. Some project researchers and community partners were primarily interested in understanding mass violence over there and ensuring that it was never forgotten. Others were more interested in the refugee experience in Montreal. Our decision to forefront the transnational life story resolved this tension. It also had the value of putting people first, exploring what mass violence meant to those most directly affected. Too often, war and genocide are understood in the abstract or the arrogant. Community university research allows us to push beyond the ways in which recorded interviews are often used in human rights research and advocacy. And here I'm thinking of the critique made by Sydney Smith and Kay Schaefer as a highly affective illustrative device, strategically placed for maximum impact, or as aggregate data in a wider accumulation of eyewitness evidence. In each instance, survivors' accounts are not permitted to live and breathe. At the outset, we needed to determine how to organize ourselves. We were big and getting bigger. Should working groups be organized around specific cultural communities? If so, how would we undertake intercultural or comparative research? Did we risk creating cultural silos? Or should groups be organized transversely around key themes? If so, would this put university researchers into the driver's seat? You could see the subtle push and pull. In the end, 7 groups formed, 4 organized around specific diasporas: Haitian, Rwandan, Cambodian, and Jewish. This is the Cambodian working group. And 3 around transversal themes: refugee youth, education, and performance. The project structure enabled team members to function in multiple languages, as English, French, Khmer, and Kinyarwanda were all regularly spoken in the day-to-day in the project's operations. So the Cambodian working group worked in French and Khmer. The Rwanda working group worked in French and Kinyarwanda. The performance working group worked mainly in English, and so on. Interviews were also conducted in Creole, Spanish, and Arabic, so we interviewed in people's home languages. Project research can be quite hierarchical, leading to a division of labor between fieldwork and interpretation. This problem is mitigated when interpretive power is widely shared, with community members authoring or co-authoring many of the project's outcomes. The project's working group structure also helped, as decision-making power was decentralized to a large degree. Another potential problem facing large projects is fragmentation. As large projects devolve into a number of small ones, I think we've all been part of projects, well, I've been part of projects like that. How might we ensure a project-wide research horizon while still working in smaller groups? Big challenge. Our project's coordinating committee, composed of 4 faculty members and 4 community members, were responsible for overall direction. The project also organized an annual assembly and 6 international conferences. What bound the project together most was everyday interaction, as our entire team was based in Montreal. And this was a conscious decision that we made at the beginning, that everyone had to be within the Montreal area. Our shared methodology also bound us together, as everyone was required to complete a 6-hour core workshop course, as well as working group specific training. So even I had to go through that. A shared online space, or Basecamp cloud computing, also helped us, as all of our documents, transcriptions, chronologies, and email were accessible to team members. So with Basecamp, you can organize it in a way that you work in your own pod, you don't see anything else, which makes it very sort of top-down, right? The coordinators would see everything, but everybody else would just sort of see their small part of the world. We made the decision that everybody would see everything except for personnel issues, which were kept separate. University research ethics in Canada, like elsewhere, I think it's probably the same here, is premised on the idea that we can regulate the interaction between 2 distinct groups of people who inhabit different places. Researchers in one place and the researched over there. Accordingly, the interaction between the 2 can be regulated and policed in advance. That's the conceit of university research ethics. University ethics also assumes that the faculty member is in control of the research process, that they own the process and its products. True collaboration destabilizes these assumptions and old lines blur. From the outset, we decided that it was important that everyone involved in the project, faculty, students, community partners, staff, tech support, everyone, participate in the interviewing. So it'd be a collective experience. So here we see Gracia Jalea, a master's student in communications, interviewing within the refugee youth context. We wanted to feel it in our chest, so that shared experience. Now in the process, I've come to realize there's no perfect location for the interviewer. Team members interviewed parents, grandparents, other members of their own cultural communities. We had a lot of, like, in the Cambodian group, a lot of young people interviewing older Cambodians. We had community people interviewing university people. We had university people interviewing community people. And what was really interesting was that those are many different points, right? The whole constellation, you look up in the sky and all those stars, right? And you connect the dots. Each connection is a different conversation. And I think that was really, that diversity to me was one of the core strengths of our project. In total, we conducted 500 multi-session interviews. One of the decisions we made was to to do multiple sessions instead of just doing one standalone session, ranging from 2 to 20 hours, the average being around 4 or 5 hours. Many of these interviews are in our searchable Stories Matter database, which you see here. So all the public interviews are now searchable within our database. The longest interviews were those conducted by the Cambodian group, which sometimes lasted 20 hours, with a single interview session going 6 or 7 hours over 2 meals, which I've never experienced. I'm not sure if I ever went to experience, right? But for some reason, within the Cambodian working group, that happened fairly frequently. Generally, the working groups began by interviewing elders, but by the project's end, we were often interviewing young people, even children. It was not unusual for team members to be both interviewer and interviewee, as many were survivors or the sons and daughters of survivors. Project interviewers and videographers were required to post their interview reflections on Basecamp within 48 hours of each interview session, while it was still fresh. Accordingly, we now have almost 1,000 written reflections from all corners of the project. Now, this is a remarkable site of reciprocal research. And I'd like to quote something from Sean Field, a great South African historian, when he wrote, "To sustain empathic listening to stories of extreme trauma, sensitive introspection of one's feelings during and after the interview is essential." And I certainly agree with that. That we really sought ways to build in reflexivity, right, into our process. Now let me ground this observation in a specific example. At least 5 team members interviewed their fathers, 2 each from the Cambodian and Rwandan groups, and 1 from the Sephardic research cluster. How each person chose to write about the experience of interviewing their father in their blogs very dramatically. Sandra Gassana, who you see here on the right, interviewed her father, Oscar, and used her interview reflection to defend her decision to interview her father. There had been some debate within the project's Rwandan group about whether the children of survivors should be allowed to interview their parents or not, whether this was a good thing or not, were they too close or not. And so in her reflection, she used it as a chance to sort of argue back, right, to that other argument. She thought that the project's memory work should operate not only within and between communities, but also within families themselves. And she went on to interview her 4 sisters. Well, actually, a little bit later, we're going to hear a digital story from her younger sister, Stephanie. Other children of survivors approached the exercise in completely different ways. In her blog, Ree Duong, who's right here, this is our book launch for our Remembering Mass Violence, and so she was one of the co-editors, and she was the leader of the Cambodian working group. In her blog, she doesn't even mention that it's her father. You think she was interviewing a stranger, right? She distanced herself entirely, and not just within the blog, within the interview itself, when you listen to it. By contrast, Paul Tom, this is Paul Tom, his sister Medavine, who became involved through the performance group, and this is his father and mother. This is an art installation coming out of the project. Paul Tom used the entire blog to reflect on his relationship to his father and his father's story. In this instance, it was his father who spoke in the third person throughout the interview. So it was his father that was making all this distance in the interview. Paul found that this was strange, and I quote, "Ce n'était pas mon père qui parlait, mais le professeur." It was not my father who spoke, but the professor. There's a great deal of silence in Paul's family about the Khmer Rouge, and Paul had many questions for his father. But he decided not to interview his father directly, but to serve as videographer. So several of the children chose the videographer's spot as sort of a safe space. He went on to write in his blog, quote, "I wanted at this stage of my relationship with my father to position myself as an observer. Behind the camera, I did not want to force things. I wanted to, above all, to listen." Now later, Paul produced an award-winning short animated film about these family silences, and I wanted to play you Now, it's 4 minutes long. It's in French. Listen to the voice. Watch. It's an animated short. And it won the prize at the Montreal
I went to the synagogue and started to pray. Two Germans, SS.
Et cette fille est restée que j'ai d'attaché avec d'autres.
J'ai préféré te taire mon histoire tout ce temps pour empêcher qu'elle ne coule dans tes veines. De toute manière, je n'en aurais jamais été capable. Pas avant cet instant. Ma bouche est restée béante trop longtemps et mes mots se sont asséchés au fond de ma gorge. Mes souvenirs se sont figés sur le sol gelé de l'hiver. Et longtemps, il a duré cet hiver. Trop longtemps. Et sous son écorce impénétrable, les morts croupissent sans avoir laissé de traces. Les morts grincent des dents et se vacarment. Il est trop bruyant pour que tu ne l'entendes pas.
Just settled in there. I mean, two Germans came in. He grabbed me.
Mais voilà qu'aujourd'hui, je vois enfin devant toi. Voilà qu'aujourd'hui, le printemps est revenu. Et les corps expirent finalement leur souffle. Tranquilles et sereines, mes lèvres se rencontrent et te racontent.
Je me disais que je ne voulais pas survivre. Finalement, j'ai réalisé que j'étais là. C'est comme si
I went to a conference, je te demandais, donc if somebody died.
J'ai vu ce qu'aucune personne n'aurait dû voir. Du jour au lendemain, on a effacé du nombre des vivants tout ce qui donnait sens au mot famille. J'ai préféré te taire mon histoire tout ce temps pour t'éloigner de ma douleur. Mais ma douleur, elle a déjà collé en toi. À ton insu. Le poids de mes souvenirs est devenu trop lourd à porter. J'ai besoin de toi. J'ai besoin de toi. Afin que la vie reprenne enfin le dessus sur l'horreur.
So from the start, we agreed that collection was not enough. North American archives are filled to the rafters, hundreds of thousands of interview recordings that have never been listened to since the day that they were recorded. We therefore sought to integrate these stories into art installations, audio walks, radio programming. We had a weekly live radio program over a year, and then we still have a radio production shop within our center that's producing radio stories every week, essentially. Documentary film, 5 or 6 have come out of the project so far. Pedagogical materials of all kinds. There was an immersive bus tour, which integrated stories of Palestinians and others. Intergenerational conversations like this one, where we had a whole day where about 70 or 80 people from the Cambodian community came together to sort of speak across generation and watch interview clips to sort of, as a way to sort of generate discussion. 500 subway cars were equipped with QR-coded digital stories over a month. There was a year-long museum exhibition. I already mentioned the searchable database. And theatrical performances ranging from Gestural Theater, where you're focusing on the hands, to playback, verbatim theater, sound theater, youth theater. This is a This is a Congolese project. And a full-scale professional theater play around the Armenian genocide. There's also scholarly publications like Remembering Mass Violence. In each instance, we sought to use oral history interviews and life stories as catalysts for personal reflection, public dialogue, and education. So in digital storytelling, for example, instead of extracting those parts of the recorded interviews that speak to us as researchers, we ask interviewees themselves what story they would like to share with the world. So you've been interviewed for 5 hours, 7 hours, 8 hours, 20 hours, what have you. So you've got 5 minutes. What story you want to share with the world? And we asked them that. And then we also invited them to actually co-produce the digital stories that went online with the National Film Board, which is a government institution, so gave it credibility and so on. So you can view those digital stories on our website. So I wanted to play a digital story from Stephanie Gassana. And this comes out of the Refugee Youth Group. And again, it's 4 minutes.
The
It's in
president of
English.
Rwanda
So you
once suggested in one of his speeches that the Tutsis should put their memories and pains in
she
a
wrote
box,
this herself.
lock it, and put it away.
Co-produced it.
Move on, look forward, and focus on the future. Is this the answer? Is there a way to connect the past to the present? Without your past, who are you? And does it matter if anyone knows? My family has tried to protect me from their story, especially my sister Solange, who has always been my protector. We were born to the same mother and father, who are from Kibuye, the capital of Western Province of Rwanda. But my life story is so different from my sister's. To begin with, we're 15 years apart. One thing Solange and I have in common is that we both keep journals. I have asked myself, if you looked at a journal page from when we were both 15, would you know that we came from the same family? That we were sisters? If I had been born at the same time as my sister, how would my life have been different? Sisterhood, silences, secrets. I am on a quest to discover my family story. If my sister and I were to write about home in a page of our journals, could you recognize us as sisters? We do share the same parents. Dad is a dreamer who loves adventure, and Mom is more protective, looking for stability, a home, when and where she could find it. I have grown up in one place, always lived in the same street in Ethiopia. I feel so attached to that particular place. It's where I have all my memories. It's my ground, my playground. It's where I feel grounded. It's where I yearn to be, and where I know I will ultimately end up. Solange, on the other hand, never knew how long she would stay in one place. She has moved with my family to Congo, Burundi, Rwanda, Ethiopia, Libya, Tunisia, France, and finally Canada, which is the place she has been the longest. There's not one country she would call home. And if we were to write about family, could you recognize us as sisters? I was born in 1990, a new era for Rwanda, full of hope and reconciliation. It was a new era for my parents as well. They had decided to have a fourth child. I am much younger than all my other sisters. I was born at the best and worst moment. My parents eventually decided to go their separate ways and forget about the past, live their dreams, and do what they were never allowed to do. My father wanted to make up for lost time. My mom devoted her life to taking care of me. And so I grew up with a single mother, and the rest of my family spread all over the world. Solange, my sister, was born at the beginning of my family story, when my parents were first coming together. She was born into a big community, surrounded by all my family members, cousins, aunts. And then, everything tragically ended with the genocide, and we lost that extended family, and lost our family at the same time. If we were to write about what identity means to us, could you recognize us as sisters? I am originally from Rwanda, but I don't speak the language, I have never lived there, and was never really able to visit for more than a week, simply because we don't have any family members left. And so having grown up in Bole, which is my neighborhood in Addis Ababa, I feel Ethiopian. I am happy when I speak the language, when I eat the food, listen to the music, and recognize Ethiopian people. Solange, on the other hand, has trouble defining her identity, calling the country hers. She remembers being told that she had no identity, that our family was stateless. Don't tell anyone we're from Rwanda, my dad said to her. And she says to me today, telling a kid to keep something from someone is as if you showed him candy and told them not to touch it. If you only knew how hard it was, my sister tells me. Well, I want to find out. Our past experiences define who we are, and it is time for me to find my definition through my families. I have so many questions for Solange. How do you build a home when you're moving all the time? Would you call yourself a refugee? Do you want to forget all about it? Will you ever share it with your children? Could your story make a difference? Some questions were left unanswered, and so I ask myself, how much do I want to know? How much should I know? How much will she allow me to know? I want to move past the secrets, understand the unspoken and all of the ups and downs, financially, socially, and emotionally. My sister knows the secrets, and I am trying to uncover them. She is my lead, my guide, and I will know just as much as she wants me to know.
So like digital storytelling, there's a great deal of synergy between oral history and the performing arts. I've already mentioned the wide variety of theatrical forms used by team members in staging oral history. Now, each of these theater projects raise unique questions and challenges. I'd like to briefly introduce you to two of these projects. And I mentioned one earlier to the students, so I have to listen to it again. In Sandeep Bagwadi's Gestural Theater, Lamentations, he combines traditional texts with contemporary fragments from those marked by mass violence. The fragments are gestural. A composer of chamber and orchestral music, Bagwadi directed each actor to study the gestural repertoire of a single interviewee, making them their own. And yet, they were told to watch the interviews with the audio turned off. As a result, the actors knew very little about the person whose gestures they were mimicking. The act of suppression of voice raises questions, of course, but I think productive ones. In reading body language in isolation, do artists end up projecting their own feelings and assumptions onto others? Whose story is it? Then again, oral historians regularly suppress the body without a second thought. Are we any better? As part of this process, Bagwadi discovered that people's bodies remember. When someone was remembering 1930s Poland, for example, their body language changed to what it would have been in that cultural and historic context. He was able to show that, prove that, through deep analysis of the video recordings that we conducted. By contrast, voices and bodies are put back into conversation in the work of the Living Histories Ensemble, a playback theater group embedded in the project. Playback theater invites audience members to share their stories in a collective storytelling space. Once told, the actors represent the story back through improvised sound, movements, and scenes. The original storyteller then gets the opportunity to respond. I have to admit I had mixed feelings at first. As an oral historian, I've always drawn a line between oral history and therapy. But here was an art form embedded in an oral history project that comes out of drama therapy. It is an intensely personal way of eliciting memories, too personal for some people. It did not take long, however, before I was persuaded by what I saw, as a Living Histories Ensemble worked with each community in turn, first the Haitians, then Holocaust survivors and their children, then the Rwandan community, and then the Cambodian community. The impact of these community-based playback sessions were profound, and the stories shared often not the same ones told within the interview space. So different kinds of storytelling spaces leads to different kinds of stories being shared. And I thought there was also a big difference between these community-based playback storytelling sessions and ones that were open to the public, where I did have a sense of more being the voyeur onto someone else's story or someone else's pain, whereas within the community ones, I thought that was sort of mitigated to a large degree. Clearly then, the Montreal Life Stories project has many different kinds of spaces where stories are being told. We are intensely aware of the ethical issues raised in every meeting, workshop, performance, screening, and even email is part of our ongoing conversation and subject to reflection and publication. In collaboration, self-reflexivity and ethnography become virtually indistinguishable. In partnership, what constitutes a research activity of the project and is therefore subject to university ethics, and what does not becomes murky. As a result, we are constantly faced with new ethical questions. Practically speaking, what do informed consent, right of withdrawal, and the mitigation of harm mean in these other project spaces? As I mentioned earlier, the interview is the most hyper-regulated space around. There's only one space among many. So how do we deal with this wider view? Collaboration and shared authorship was crucial in my experience in avoiding what some people in Aboriginal studies call the foreign disciplinary gaze. Sydney Smith and Kay Schaefer have raised the troubling questions about the use of life story material by human rights organizations, where little bits of first-person testimony are deployed as an authenticating device for non-resident human rights workers and researchers. Thoughtlessly soliciting autobiography, writes Julie Salverson, a really great theater theorist. I'd recommend her highly. Thoughtlessly soliciting autobiography may reproduce a form of cultural colonialism that is at the very least voyeuristic. Can justice, she adds, be orchestrated or at least inspired by presenting pain as an unexamined spectacle? In sharing survivor stories, do we risk eroticizing injury? Is sharing always the right thing to do? If not, under what circumstances can life stories be shared? By whom and with whom? These are key questions, and who gets to decide is crucial. On this note, I'd like to end this presentation with an example taken from the Rwandan working group. Next month, it'll be 20 years since the 1994 genocide. From its earliest days, the Life Stories project has benefited from the significant and sustained involvement of Montreal's Rwandan community, the largest in Canada. Of the 19 group members, all but 3 were of Rwandan origin, including the scholars. So the cultural divide that you often see between university-based researchers and the communities that are being studied was not there within that working group. One of the great strengths of our working group structure is that it provides space for community-directed research within the larger community university framework. The Rwandan group was thus responsible for the interview coordination within its own community. The memory work of the Rwandan group culminated in a day of reflection, which brought together about 120 people for 7 hours. The day's events were introduced by Kalix Kabayiza, who was the leader of the group, who reminded everyone that community members knew their own history. It is our history, he said, our little histories within the big history of our country. Kalix then spoke of the pressing need to transmit this history to young people in the community. Over the course of the day, the Rwandan audience, including many of the interviewees themselves, watched 3 20-minute digital stories drawn from the interviews. They composed them themselves, sort of tapestries. Each one was a tapestry. A round table panel then spoke after each screening, followed by question and answer periods. In the first 2 instances, the commentators were all interviewees who spoke of their first-hand experiences. In the third, the panel consisted of young people who spoke of exile, survival, and integration into Quebec. And you may have heard there's a big debate now in Quebec around the cultural charter where they want to ban all religious clothing or symbols in terms of public servants. So it's sort of the French model, they're trying to apply it in Quebec. The discussion was honest, revealing differences of opinion about the role of the Catholic Church in the genocide. And everyone seemed to ask, why the violence? Why us? Throughout the day, participants were invited to fill out square memory cards like this one and pin them on the front wall under a specific year. So they had 1945 all the way to 2012. This ligne de temps, this timeline activity, resulted in an entire wall covered in brightly colored memory cards. At the end of each session, people slowly wrote down a selected memory or two and walked to the front to place it with all the others. The community's history thus took shape from all of these individual memories. The memory workshop was organized from, by, and for Montreal's Rwandan community. This, to me, represents the full collaborative potential of community university research. Normally, the historical timeline is the preserve of the historian or journalist who decides what was and was not significant. Typically, it tells us only of the big history from a bird's eye perspective. Here, by contrast, we see a timeline created collaboratively from the little histories drawn from individual memory. Recorded interviews thus served as a catalyst for dialogue within the community, bridging those exiled before 1994 and those who experienced the genocide directly, who were in Rwanda in 1994, and that was a big chasm within the community. It also connected young people born after the genocide who live in its shadow. And in a few cases, it also brought Tutsi and Hutu into conversation. One of the academics in the working group was a Hutu psychologist, which was a big, important moment within the community. In all these cases, community members connected their little histories to the big history of colonialism, decolonization, the Cold War, and of course the world's complicity in the 1994 genocide. Yet it was not a timeline drained of its emotional content. History is intensely personal. It also, I think, belongs to all of us. So let's open it up. That's the formal thing, right? And that's questions.
What's the status of the project now?
So the project was from 2005 to 2012, but it's still continuing in the sense of publication. So we had a launch of the first edited collection in January. There's a monograph being launched next month. There's a second edited collection called Beyond Testimony and Trauma, Oral History in the Aftermath of Mass Violence, coming out in February. And then another book is in the works. The different working groups have, like the Rwandan group and the Cambodian group have created documentation centers. So one of the things at the end of the project was we didn't want to have all the products just residing within the university, so everything was replicated. So all the public interviews, all the blogs, everything are in the Montreal Holocaust Memorial Center, the Rwandan Documentation Center, the Cambodian Documentation Center. There was already a Haitian organization, right? So that way they're building capacity within their own communities. That was a big part of our project, was that we wanted to build capacity within the communities themselves. And so the young people who are often the interview coordinators and so on, they're still very much, at the forefront of things. When the project, someone was asking me, like, it's a very intense kind of project, right? Like, there's a lot of things happening. There's a lot of people. We began with 40, ended with over 300. We decided that we didn't want to immediately apply for another grant, in the sense that we needed to sort of, recover, right, from 6 or 7 years. And I thought that was a good decision, because I think one of the tendencies might become, if you get into autopilot, it becomes institutional in a way, right? And this way, we're ramping up, and I think what the next project will be around the archive itself, and thinking about a living archive, these 500 interviews, and working them within the different communities and so on. And that's still going on. Like next month in April, we have all kinds of activities. And of course, all these different people are part of the Center for Oral History and Digital Storytelling, so they are still very much present, still very active, right? But the project as such, right, ended in 2012 officially.
I think one of the challenges in sharing authority beyond the interview is getting the narrators to want to share the work and the time investment of making these kinds of public products. So it seems clearly the fact that you involved the community groups and narrators from the very beginning of the planning process would get people invested, but I'm wondering what else you were able to do to keep people involved at that level, and particularly in terms of sharing funding and distributing funding.
So to me, the initial phase is the key phase of any project. That's when the structures get created and the expectations and so on. And so we spent a year imagining that project. So from 2005 to 2006, we met monthly and we grew organically, right? And we made a decision that we were not going to fund individuals. We're going to only fund the constituent parts. So you had to have, we had 7 working groups, right? In order to be a working group, you had to have both university and community at the table. So we had 3 excellent Latin American researchers, but they had no connection to the community groups in Montreal, so they couldn't form a Latin American working group. But they were involved in the refugee youth group, right? And so that's, so one of the issues that we faced at the beginning was, one of the dangers of our project was that we're locating the violence everywhere else but here, right? So it becomes like another sort of underground railway kind of story, right? And so we did a lot of events with an Aboriginal group working with Aboriginal survivors of residential schooling, where we would have joint screenings. So we see our digital stories plus their digital stories, right? And I think there was certainly pressure within the project politically to expand, right? So expand within the groups. Like the Haitian group began with very much focused on, we're going to look at the Duvalier era, 1960s refugees. Of course, young people are coming in and saying, well, I'm a refugee from Aristide, where there's a lot of human rights violations since then, right? And so they forced it open, right? And also they interviewed, beyond that first generation of Haitian exiles in Montreal, which was a hugely important group. And then the 3 sort of culturally specific working groups, they did a lot of heavy lifting sort of beyond sort of the 4 institutionalized partnerships, I guess you can say. So that's where we had like interviews, like work being done in the Palestinian community, which is great. You have Palestinian work going on in the same project as with Holocaust survivors and Sephardic Jews, right? I think we were able to do that because it was sort of decentralized to some extent. Whenever there was things so there was a budget that was agreed to, but if people did not spend their budgets, the money went into a central envelope and we had an open competition. That way we were able to fund things that were new. that we hadn't expected, right? And so every year, and that committee was a community university committee. And so when someone comes up there and says, I have a great idea, fund me, if you're just a university person, you aren't thinking about who's this for, right? You won't get funded, or you're less likely, right? And so that flexibility, that institutional flexibility, I think served us well, and so we grew. And then each working group worked as a collective. And so when people apply to join, the working group would decide whether yes or no you can join or not. And so some working groups were like, no, we don't want to grow too much, right? The Haitian group said, 10's enough, right? Like no more, right? The Cambodian, it's just crazy, right? It was like everyone. So it varied from group to group, and that elasticity to me was really important. And so it's not standardized. The dynamic in each group was different, which to me is not a problem. Yep.
A related question, very practical. Were some or all of the working group members paid for their time?
So profs, so there were 10 profs who got a course release, right? As part of a university funding in Canada, you get a course release. We put the same amount of money into community release. So it was identical amount of money, but how do you deliver it, right, is the question, right? Because most of these people have day jobs. They're not working, our partners were not partners where they're hired researchers, right? They're working at, they're working wherever, right? And so their employer, so what we did was we gave honorariums, right? That way they can cover like daycare, parking, all this stuff, right? And that was just a matter of course. So any community member that had any kind of administrative load, which meant on a committee or co-leader of a working group, automatically got what we call community release. Like automatically, it wasn't like a deciding thing. And that way we thought it was fair, right? The same amount of money in terms of the project.
Thank you for your presentation. I am very interested in the multimedia aspect of it. It strikes me as a real achievement. You showed us very different media.
Mm-hmm.
For instance, the film, the short, beautiful film by Paul Tom, that used a style which was unrealistic.
Yeah.
And the digital story was a circular narrative, like many African stories are. And then you had written reflections, and you had an exhibition. So, and also, some of these expressions were done by professionals, you said, and some were not. So the question is, how do you keep all this together? I am involved in a project which is very different, but we share the multimedia ambition. And there is a serious question of how you keep these things together and also how you share them with the question of professionality exists.
So one mechanism that we had, right, was we had an artist in residency program. So every year we were able to fund a couple of artists from the communities themselves, right? And they would make a proposal, and the committee again was a blended committee, and they would do all kinds of stuff, right? And sometimes they would sort of riff off someone else's, like, so it's like sort of in dialogue or in counter dialogue, right? I used the example before of Gestural Theater. Next year, someone proposed sound theater, where it's the exact opposite, right? And so you had this synergy going back and forth. With digital storytelling, it was more, and with radio, it was more centralized. So we had this radio production shop called Radio Works. And so we had, using interns and volunteers and team members, we had a partnership with 2 radio stations. And so we produced content, right, centrally in a way, right? And that practice changed over time. At the beginning, it was very much sort of professional in the sense of, producers go out, find the content, go deliver, right? And by the end, we had changed them, right? And it made it more collaborative. Like, why isn't that collaborative, whereas our digital storytelling was collaborative, right? Why is it different, right? And so to me, what was really important in the project was that there were many authors, many different media, right, reaching a variety of different publics, right, and they aren't all saying the same thing. Like to me, it's like a good interview. A good interview, you're knocking on the door saying, "Can I come in here?" And they're opening up the door here saying, "Come in this part of my life," and you're sort of exploring like that, right? That's what you're doing in a project, right? It's the same thing. It's an exploration. It's a mutual sort of exploration, and I think that diversity of authorship takes off some of the pressure. Like if it's all centralized, it puts a lot of pressure on that outcome to be all things to all people, right? You know, like, yeah. So I have a book coming out next month. My name's on it. It says Steve High in the front, right? Should I feel guilty about that? I would if I was the only outcome of the project. You know, I'd say it's not right, you know? But because it's actually the last thing coming out, everybody else has had their chance to sort of go out there and do things. I just feel like I'm a latecomer, really. So I don't feel that's a problem. So to me, it's about a shared conversation, right? You know, it's the conversation that matters rather than the conclusions that individuals draw from those just like we do in academic work, right?
Yes, but I don't believe, you said they all say the same thing. The message is the same?
No, they don't say the same thing.
Okay.
It's the opposite.
Okay.
No,
I didn't
yeah,
understand
no,
that.
no. And so, you know, so with digital storytelling, so we had a digital storytelling coordinator, actually Paul Tom, right? So he was a part-time staffer, right? He worked 20 hours a week. And so when interviewees were interviewed, we sent them like, you know, the DVD with a feedback forms. We got a third of them gave us back what they thought of the interview. But also we had an invitation. Do you want to get involved in the project in some way? And we give a few choices. One was, do you want your digital story, right? And then he would then work with people. And some people would be sitting there. You had Holocaust survivors sitting there in our lab day after day. We're truly co-producing something. Like Paul's here and they're there and they're working at it. Other ones are saying, okay, this is what I want. Come back to me with your, you know, I'll sign off on it, right? And so it was much more relaxed, right? And so each one was different, but we had mechanisms, right? That's not what I'm saying. It's mechanisms. You have mechanisms that allow us to do things. And some things grew in importance, like Playback Theater. It became a central part of the conversation. Not in year 1, not in year 2, but by year 5 and 6, it became really important. People got used to the idea. Yeah.
Thank you so much. It's so incredibly rich and inspiring. I see all of the students taking notes about what we should be doing, and I feel the same way. I'm curious about whether or not you've had any kind of synergistic conversations across the groups.
Oh yeah.
How did that happen? And did you structure it? Did it happen naturally? And what came out of it?
Great question, and it's something that's one of the big outcomes, I think, is the Rwandan group organized a conference early on testimony in the Rwandan genocide in 2008, and invited the Cambodian group to sort of participate. And it was a wonderful event because they basically mobilized academic knowledge for the community, which to me was like, you want to do that? Okay, right? And they brought all these people from all around the world, brought them to Montreal. It was the community that was the audience, right? And the Cambodian group was so impressed by that. 2 years later, they had their own conference where they mobilized global academic knowledge, right? Brought in, and you have 200 Cambodian Montrealers there getting the best possible scholarship, right? That's what they wanted, right? Then you had so the Rwandans organized this Ligne de Temps, this intergenerational conversation. The Cambodians did the same thing, right? They both have documentation centers. There's now an exhibition at the Holocaust Memorial Center where it's the Holocaust Center, the Rwandan Documentation Center, and the Cambodian Documentation Center have co-done it, right? And they're going to do rotational stuff, right? And so it's led to all kinds of connection, huge amount of connection, right? Which wasn't explicit in our grant application. It just happened because people were in conversation and got inspired by each other, right? Or Paul Tom, like one of the key moments for him was when he heard a public testimony of a Rwandan Hutu, and he was so moved by it. I remember this moment, you know, and this was pivotal for him to do this film, right? And so you have, you know, and again, each community is at a different place, I think, too. Of course, the Jewish community was, you know, is very well organized, long history of doing work, and so the other communities were very interested in being in relationship there. But there's the other ones which I also found, you know, really quite inspiring. And actually, even the launch of the project, the Cambodian group organized that, and they, you know, they had this huge hall. I remember walking in there going, oh my God, because it's like this huge hall, and it was like tables of like tapestry and artifacts, and, you know, a book table of all the books they had, and they had student projects, and they had a stage where it was like a black skirt, and they had pinned in fall flowers, they had Cambodian dance, they had Cambodian food, and every, I say that, I think I said this in the introduction of the book, yeah, every academic room was like, oh my God, we gotta deliver, right? All the expectation, right? And talk about pressure, right? But then in the academy, so often we work sort of, not in a vacuum, but we work sort of in isolation, right? And so to me that was really an important motivator. And I think what was also interesting is over time, people started working across the working groups, right? So to me, it's not necessarily turning away from, right? If it's depending on what your project's sort of about, right? But it's a great article, and I think, you know, it's a, you know, I think it's a good, that's really a question we ask a lot of ourselves, is like, why, you know, like, who are we? Is this worth it? And even the communities are talking about that too. I remember the last Rwandan event, they were asking, well, when is someone ready to share their story? What does that mean? Right? Huge question.
All right, well, thank you very, very much for coming in.